Good afternoon, everyone. It is presently Friday, July 3rd, 2020 at 6:10 p.m. Tonight we shall be reading Unintended Consequences by John Ross, Part 2F, Growth Continued. We shall begin tonight's reading on page 176 at the start of Chapter 60, entitled Birthday, January 10th, 1964. I do apologize for the delay since the publishing of the last chapter. I recently moved into a new house, and as I'm sure you can imagine, it has been a rather hectic month. In any case, let us begin. Unintended Consequences, Part 2F, Growth Continued, Chapter 60, Birthday, January 10th, 1964. God damn it! Harold Gaines roared at his son. Why the hell did you have to go cheat on a test, for Christ's sake? The elder Gaines demanded. He had revised his question at the last moment. Have to get caught cheating on a test was what he had been on the verge of asking. No one knew there would be a quiz the first week back from school, Richard blubbered. It wasn't a real test or anything, he added defensively. All the more reason not to risk getting flunked out, you fucking idiot, Harold replied. Richard thought it best to avoid pointing out that he was already failing the math course. Now I'll have to go make nice with the teacher again, Harold fumed. Dad will probably have to give him some money again because I'm so stupid, Richard thought miserably. Maybe you can come up with a C- on your next quiz, Harold said in a voice that dripped with sarcasm, then turned away from his son in dismissal. Richard Gaines hung his head and left the room. I wish Dad would help me understand my math homework, he thought bleakly. It did not occur to Richard Gaines that his father's academic abilities were no greater than his own. Elsewhere, well, good evening, birthday boy. Henry Bowman rolled his eyes as he came into the kitchen after being dropped off from sledding with some of the other boys from school. His mother Catherine knew that the phrase mildly embarrassed her son, and she laughed at his reaction. Come get some hot chocolate before it cools. Your Uncle Max is here, and Irwin Mon is with him. They're with your father in his study, waiting for you to get back. I think they have something to show you. Henry shrugged out of his coat, pulled his galoshes off, and put them on the porch to dry. He took the cup of cocoa from his mother and patted into his father's study in his socks. Max Collins was sipping a scotch and water, and Irwin Mon had a beer in his hand. Walter Bowman drank tea. Well, look who made it back. You didn't freeze your little dingus off now, did you? Max Collins was grinning his most engaging grin. Henry smiled and lowered his eyes. He knew his uncle didn't really expect an answer. Happy birthday, Henry, Irwin Mon said to the boy. Thank you. Henry, your uncle and Mr. Mon have some presents for you, as do I. They all go together, though, so we thought we'd see that you caught us all at the same time. Max Collins held out a box that was blue-gray, about 3 inches thick and roughly the size of a legal notepad of paper. This one goes first. Was going to buy it for myself, but decided you needed it more. Let me borrow it sometime and maybe I'll decide to get one too. Henry took the box, and his eyes got big as soon as he saw the Smith & Wesson logo stamped into the lid. A Smith & Wesson presentation case. He had heard of them, but had never seen one himself. He knew of only one gun that the company shipped in a presentation case, and his hands felt awkward as he lifted the lid. His information was correct. Inside was an N-frame .44 Magnum with a 5-inch barrel. That was unusual. The big Smith & Wesson was catalogued with 4-inch, 6.5-inch, and 8 3/8-inch barrels. The gun Henry was staring at had been one of a special run of 500 made for H. Harris & Co. in 1958. The metal glowed with the milk blue finish that was characteristic of all of Smith & Wesson's best guns made while Carl Hellstrom was still in charge of operations. Henry lifted the revolver out of the satin lining, pressed the cylinder latch forward, and swung out the cylinder. Each of the 6 chambers was burnished with the factory's proprietary process that allowed fired cases to drop effortlessly out of the chamber, even when maximum pressure loads were used. Henry closed the cylinder, cocked the weapon, and tried the trigger pull. The trigger broke without a trace of creep at what Henry judged was no more than 2 pounds. With a release like breaking glass, the double-action pull was smooth and positive, and Henry immediately noticed that the trigger itself was not the standard wide-grooved target version that was best suited for slow fire, but was instead a smooth, polished one perfect for double-action shooting. Max Collins saw his nephew examining the non-standard piece. Fran Longton, in the service department in Massachusetts, set you up with that trigger when I told him the way you were apt to use the gun. He says it's their Jordan combat trigger, made for Bill Jordan on the Border Patrol in Texas, and anyone else that's on the company's good side. Henry had written to Fran Longton when the trigger stud of his uncle's .357 had broken, and he had sent it back to the factory for repair. Longton had inquired as to how many rounds had been fired through the weapon, and Henry had replied that he had shot over 20,000 rounds through the gun in the year he had used it, but had no idea how many had gone through it prior. The service manager had apologized for the premature failure, and sent Henry 1,000 fired cases along with the repaired gun as a bonus. "This here's from your dear old dad," Walter Bowman said, holding out a cardboard box. Henry laid down the revolver and took the package from his father. It was heavy, and when he opened it, he saw why. Inside were a pair of 8 cavity bullet molds with handles. He did not need to read the letters stamped on the mold blocks to know that they were made by Hensley and Gibbs in Oregon State. Only H&G had the skill to properly manufacture 8 cavity gang molds. "I was going to get you just one mold," Walter explained. "Then I wrote to the folks up there, and they told me to buy a pair, made at the same time with the cavities matched to a 0.5 of an inch, so you can fill one and let it cool while you're filling the other one. Said with practice you could cast over 1,500 bullets an hour, so you wouldn't have to spend so much time down in the foundry." Walter used the term his wife had jokingly invented to describe the corner of the basement Henry had set up to cast bullets. "They feel a little heavy, but I would guess your wrists are up to it. It's good exercise for a revolver shooter," Henry said immediately, then smiled. "Mr. Mann has something for you also," added Walter. Erwin Mann reached behind a leather armchair and retrieved a steel 5-gallon bucket with a wire loop carrying handle. It was obviously fairly heavy. He set it down in front of Henry, who lifted the lid. It was filled to the brim with empty brass .44 Magnum cartridge cases. "Should be about 4,000 there," Erwin said, speaking for the first time. "And on top of that, I've got the dyes, 5,000 primers, and 4 4-pound cans of Hercules 2400 powder coming Monday or Tuesday," Max threw in. "You can start casting this weekend and be shooting by next Saturday." Henry did not know what to say. His feet were still cold from sledding, but he did not notice it. His hot chocolate was long forgotten. He picked up the revolver again, then looked at his father. "Can I cast some after supper, Dad?" "I don't see why not. It's Friday, after all. How much lead do you have left?" "I was almost out, but Mom took me by the Goodyear place on Monday for more wheel weights. I got them all melted down, fluxed, and cast into ingots this week. I have almost 200 pounds of alloy." He was rapidly calculating how many bullets that would make. Each .44 caliber slug was 250 grains, and there were 7,000 grains to a pound. A little less than 40 pounds per 1,000. That's enough for about 5,000 bullets, I'd say. Max Collins laughed. "If you don't have to wait for the molds to warm up and the lead to melt, hell, kid, you could knock those out tonight," he joked. As it turned out, Henry turned on his 3 lead furnaces and started preheating the molds on a hot plate before sitting down to dinner. He got to bed a little after midnight. When he did, he was once again out of bullet alloy. New chapter here. Chapter 61. Pen Pal. March 12, 1964. The return address on the envelope made Henry Bowman grin. Kane's Custom Ammo, it proclaimed. Henry had been very pleased with the first reply he had received from Alan Kane, but he had been afraid that he might not hear from the man again. In Henry's second letter, he had confessed to the nationally recognized ammunition expert that he was only 11 years old. The envelope he held in his hands was thick, and Henry tore it open. To call Alan Kane's typing mediocre was to be charitable. Henry would not discover for 2 years that Kane's left hand was permanently damaged, the result of a farm accident when Kane was 15. Henry did not care at all that the letter was riddled with typos. Though his spelling and grammar were impeccable, Henry's own handwriting was far from pretty. Kane didn't complain about the letter I sent, Henry thought. He began to read the letter which had obviously been hammered out on an aging manual typewriter. "Hi, Henry. 11, huh? I got my first 45 when I was 7, but no 44 mag until I was almost 14. You mentioned Ken Bell apiece in 1959 Digest. Jim Harvey's dead, killed himself, but Lakeville Arms bullets still available. And yes, they are good. Protect the bore with the zinc washer, okay? But the jugular is the one to use for long range out of a wheel gun. I was Jim's Indiana distributor back in 1957, and that was when I was in the 8th grade. 2400 is okay in 44, but 295 grain hollow point is better, don't care what Keith says. Not in real cold weather, though, but any other time, yes. Try the 24 grain with H&G 503, not with jacketed, though. They raise pressures and will tear out your barrel the way we shoot. Also, rip a hole in your wallet. Load 9.5 unique and 250 Keith. Your girlfriend can shoot this when you get old enough to have one, rest assured. Don't tell Smith & Wesson, but the end frames are much stronger than they ever thought. I have one with 75,000 rounds, all at least 3 grains over listed max. I broke the trigger stud like you did, but it still shoots 6-inch groups even at 100 yards, despite the forcing cone being out of edge. Franny Longtine wanted to replace it, but I said not until the frame cracked. Glad you got the 5-inch with Jordan trigger. It's the best type of carry gun, don't sell it. Get an 83 out of 8 in for best long range when you get older and stronger, like maybe next week. Many like the light bullets in 44, but they will wear out your forcing cone if you shoot a lot and won't hit hard at long range like the heavy ones. Most people think 300 plus yards with a wheel gun is a lie, but glad to hear you know it just takes some practice. Was at Elmer's last summer. A guy called him a liar about long range work. Keith pulled out $500 in bills, it looked like, and said take 500 big steps back, then turn around, stand still for 6 shots. If you can walk away, it's yours. Guy left in a hurry. Keith was mad. I know he would have done it. If you want to try 500 or 600 yards, buy some 270 grain in jugulars with jacket covering lead up to the shoulder and no lead touching the bore. They're in the list. I'll take off 20% for all dealer prices. Special discount for 5-inch barrel 44 shooters who don't shave yet. Use the 22 caliber 295 grain hollow point and mag primer, and it should do real well if the weather's not too cold. Make a royal mess out of groundhogs too. Yes, I often shoot on paper at 200 yards. If the loading is good and you are on sandbags, then an 8-inch group with iron sights is no big surprise. Be sure to rest the frame on the bag, not the barrel, or they will string vertically. Also use an old towel, as the blast from the cylinder gap will ruin your bags. You must have good crimp though, or bullets will pull under recoil and accuracy goes all to hell even if the gun doesn't tie up. Be sure to crimp in the crimp groove, not over the front drive band like some idiots do. Write to the company star. They make the best goodies and get a 7/8 inch bushing for your press. Tell them you want the 2-step 450 or 475 carbide sizer like mine. Don't let them talk you out of it like they always try to do. Ammo may look funny, but will shoot great, I promise you. Polish down your expander so it only bells the case mouth and get a star roll crimp die too. Then you will be all set. Be sure to put a 5-gallon bucket of water by your casting setup. Dump the bullets out of the mold into it. They'll be harder that way and won't foul up your barrel with lead as easily. Also not so many dings or dents on bullets. Dings don't matter for blasting ammo, but customers complain so I shoot 'em myself. Beeswax aloe mix is best lube for full power loads to avoid leading the barrel. For light loads anything'll work okay, but you don't shoot those either, do you? Rob a bank if you have to, but get yourself a star loader. It's worth the money. 500 rounds an hour, then you can spend more time shooting and not loading. The wait on a 44 is over a year, but well worth it. So get your dad and uncle thinking about it now. I have used a single stage too, and you need a star, trust me. Write me before you buy one, and I'll tell you what to tell Mac you want when he builds it, and what spare parts you'll need. Also, you need to get a proprietary star sizer luber. It'll do a lot better job than whatever you're using now. And 3 or 4 times as fast, too. I guarantee it. Also, if you like big guns, then you should have a Solothern like the ad inside. Shot one a couple months ago, and they're goddamn beautiful and accurate to boot. Just an idea. Good shooting. Alan. Henry turned to the next page and saw that Alan had enclosed his entire price list with a note again reminding him to deduct 20% from the printed dealer prices. Poring over the ad for the Solothern kept Henry occupied until his mother called him for dinner. He knew that he would probably never get one. But still, it was fun to dream. The letter from Kane gave Henry something else as well. Ever since he had walked into his first gun store with his Uncle Max and met Al Goodman, Henry had found that adults ignored his age and treated him as an equal when their interests involved shooting. Al, Doc Weinman, Erwin Mahn, and now Alan Kane had proved this to him. The boy was experiencing something that was true for all people in the gun culture regardless of age or native language. Henry's skills and passion would one day make him a welcome guest in the homes of people he had never met before. In the years to come, Alan Kane would become one of his closest friends. It was a friendship that would shape the course of Henry Bowman's entire life. Henry folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. People who take shooting skills seriously have a natural affinity for one another, Henry thought. It doesn't matter how old they are. Henry would observe this phenomenon over and over again in the coming years. Unfortunately, however, the people who had become the gun culture's mortal enemies would also be well aware of this truth. New chapter here. Enclosed here on page 181 is an advertisement for the Solothern discussed in chapter 61. The ad reads as follows. Most powerful rifle ever made. Nazi 20mm Solothern semi-automatic anti-tank rifle. With high-power telescopic sight. Rifle comes as shown with all accessories included. The ultimate rifle. Here is the rarest modern firearm ever offered to the American collector. The biggest, most powerful rifle ever made, in very good to excellent condition. Designed in 1938 by order of Hitler's General Staff, the Solothern S-18-1000 was used on all fronts against all Allied armies. Its devastating accuracy, coupled with torrent-like firepower, were directly responsible for the frantic redesigning of nearly all Allied armored fighting vehicles. Fantastically rare. This latest and greatest Solothern catches everyone's eye. It will be the showpiece of your collection. Its 80 caliber or 20mm bore, fast semi-automatic fire, superb engineering, and deadly efficiency make other anti-tank rifles look like toys by comparison. Yet its efficient muzzle brake lets you shoot this exciting rifle with ease. Statistics. Each gun ordnance checked and test fired. Hurries a 1/3 of a pound armor-piercing shell up to 4 miles. Its terrific muzzle velocity plus special wide-field telescopic sight allow rapid fire with pinpoint accuracy at 1 kilometer, or 3/8 of a mile. Will cleanly penetrate 2 inches of finest steel armor plate. Quick detachable barrel. Muzzle velocity 2,700 feet per second. Barrel length 4 foot 4 inches. 10-shot magazine. Semi-automatic action. Federal government deems it legal to own with no license required. Comes fitted with original high-power calibrated telescopic sight at no extra charge. Sight is illuminated for night fighting. Absolutely complete. All 52 original accessories and spare parts are included absolutely free. Your gun comes to you with following. Original ordnance-fitted chest. 10 magazines. Complete assorted covers and carrying devices. All spare parts in original metal boxes and leather bag. 1 dummy exercise cartridge, very rare. Complete special tools, detachable muzzle brake, complete cleaning kit. Items. Complete precision armorer's kit in top grain leather case. Tools for 1,000 uses. An exceptional and useful bonus. Every special extra ever issued with this gun. Nothing else to buy. This complete package worth $635 US on late 1957 collector's market. Rare ammo. At a price you can afford to shoot, mind you. 20mm Solothern anti-tank rifle ammunition. A $12 cartridge on the collector's market in original cardboard tubes. To gun buyers only. 10 rounds for $9.95. Case of 1,000 rounds for $75. To cartridge collectors, single rounds, $3.95 each. Your price complete, $189.50 US. Layaway plan, $25 down and $25 per month holds your gun until it is paid for. To order, send check, cash, or money order, $40 US deposit for COD. Shipped by freight. Cadmus Industries, 74 Craft Bridge, 5880 Hollywood Boulevard, Los Angeles, Room 28, California. The rifle itself is honestly a glorious piece, and for those reading this or listening to the audio version in future, please note that Forgotten Weapons has done videos on this particular rifle, and you can watch those on YouTube for free. Truly a magnificent item. Continuing now with the PDF version of this text. New chapter here. Beginning here on page 182 of the PDF version, or page 215 of the softcover print edition, we begin chapter 62, Mail Order Gifts, January 10th, 1967. On most school mornings, Henry Bowman was a little drowsy when he left his room to go downstairs for breakfast, and even though it was Henry's birthday, this morning was no exception. He would have tripped over the packing crate if it hadn't been quite so large. It was lying in the upstairs hall just outside his bedroom door, and for a brief instant in the dim light he thought it was a grandfather clock that was lying on its side. Then he saw the rough texture of the crate and noticed the strange markings stenciled on the side of the dark wood. Tankbush S18 1000, caliber 20mm. Suddenly Henry realized what he was looking at. "Dad! A Solothern! You got me a Solothern?" Henry yelled at the top of his lungs before realizing that his father probably did not need to be told this fact. His voice was considerably deeper now than it had been a few months ago, and the sound carried throughout the entire house. Walter Bowman, always an early riser, left the kitchen and climbed the stairs. He flicked on the upstairs hall light as he mounted the steps. "Your buddy in New Jersey tried to talk me into a Lottie, because it was a little cheaper, until he found out who it was for. He said the Solotherns were going fast." Walter said this last with a wry grin. He only had 3 left. Of course, he did admit that the original shipment came into the country 10 years ago. "Most people don't have a good place to shoot them, and the ammo's kind of expensive," Henry said defensively. "But I think I can get the dies and load it." "Well, you'll have a couple hundred cases to reload if you shoot up the 2 crates of ammo that are in the basement. I didn't bother to lug them up here." "You got me 200 rounds of ammo for the Solothern?" Henry almost shouted. That quantity of ammunition was nothing special for a .22, or even a surplus military rifle. But 200 20mm cannon shells was another matter entirely. Each 20mm cartridge was the size of a large banana and weighed about a pound. Your favorite distributor virtually insisted on it once he knew the gun was for you. He said you'd want tracer HE rounds, whatever the hell that is. Walter looked at his watch. "I probably shouldn't have mentioned this to you until this afternoon. Now you won't have much concentration at school." Christ. "Can we shoot it this weekend?" "Only if your mother doesn't need the station wagon. I don't think we could fit this monster in the Corvette." Henry Bowman looked longingly at the crate, realizing that there was not enough time to open it and disassemble his new prize before going to school. He grabbed the near end of it, and with some effort slid the 120-pound box into his bedroom and shoved it out of the way against the wall. Walter Bowman was exactly right. Throughout all his classes that day, Henry's mind was not on his studies. It was on the magnificent example of Swiss craftsmanship that was waiting for him back in his room. New chapter here. Chapter 63. Solothern'S Christening. January 14th, 1967. Mom, where's Dad?" Richard Gaines asked his mother as she handed him his orange juice. "I need to get over to Sandy's house." "He's still asleep, and you mustn't wake him," Linda Gaines admonished her son. "He had to stay up late last night." This was almost true. Harold Gaines was, in actuality, sleeping off a major drunken episode. "But Sandy and me had plans," he said plaintively. "Sandy and I," Linda corrected. "I have some errands to run today. I can take you over to your friend's house. Don't worry." Your father can stay in bed. He's tired. Let him rest." Richard turned away. Tired was his mother's way of saying drunk. Richard's friend Sandy's house was not far from where Joe Hammond lived, but this fact did not cross the boy's mind. "Let me have about 15 minutes to fix my makeup, and I'll be ready to go, all right?" "Ugh, Mom, you don't have to put on any makeup for that," Richard said, trying to be funny. Richard's mother gave him a quick smile, then turned and walked towards the washroom. "The hell I don't. The hell I don't," she said in a whisper after the door was shut behind her. Elsewhere, "So where is the intrepid field artillery off to today?" Catherine Bowman asked of her husband and son as she joined them at the breakfast table. Her son took a breath, and immediately sang. "So it's hi-yi, hi-yi, in the field artillery, count off your numbers loud and strong, 1, 2, Walter chimed in. "And wherever you go, you will always know that the caissons go rolling along." Henry finished. "No singing at the table," Catherine kidded good-naturedly. "We're going to shoot the cannon Dad got me," Henry said proudly. "It's really big." Recorded by the U.S. Army. Chorus, Songs of the Soldier. Delightful. Now then, returning to the text. "So where is the intrepid field artillery off to today?" Catherine Bowman asked of her husband and son as she joined them at the breakfast table. Her son took a breath and immediately sang. "So it's hi-hi-yi in the field artillery, count off your numbers loud and strong, 1, 2, Walter chimed in. "And wherever ye go, you will always know that the caissons go rolling along," Henry finished. "No singing at the table," Catherine kidded good-naturedly. "We're going to shoot the cannon Dad got me," Henry said proudly. "It's really big. Not as big as some of the stuff your old man got to play with when he was in the Navy," Walter said. "What's the biggest gun you ever got to shoot, Dad?" "Got to touch off some shots out of a 5-inch rifle on a destroyer in 1942.
and I was on board the battleship Missouri when she fired all 9 of her 16-inch rifles, later that same year. I didn't get to pull the trigger, of course, but that was just as well. The view was better from where I was watching. 9 16-inch guns, Henry said, awed at the thought. What did that sound like? Like the absolute, no-fooling, this time it's for real, honest-to-God end of the world, Walter said with a big smile. I've never seen anything like it before or since. That whole 50,000-ton ship moved sideways in the water about 8 feet when those 9 rifles fired. How accurate were they? With the fire control system we had back then, they could hit something the size of a small house at 20 miles, as I recall. Not bad for a gun platform sloshing around in a choppy sea. Henry quickly did some mental arithmetic. A 40-foot group at 35,000 yards. That's almost 1 minute of angle accuracy. The best 30 caliber 1,000-yard target rifles aren't any better than that at a 15th of the distance. Haven't you told me that your big caliber rifles shoot pretty well with almost any ammo, but the small bores need careful load development to get really good accuracy? The boy chewed his lip. I guess it really is easier to make a big gun shoot well, if you've got good components, Henry said finally. Shall we see how that rule applies to the newest addition to your arsenal? Henry was already out of his chair and carrying his breakfast plate over to the sink. Enough fooling around, Henry said under his breath. It's time to touch it off. Henry Bowman took a deep breath as he lay in the grass and aimed through the telescopic sight mounted on the left side of the receiver. He started to squeeze the Solotherns trigger with both his index and middle fingers, which was how the big gun had been designed to be fired. The Solothern cannon, as a piece of military ordnance designed to stop tanks, was a colossal misallocation of resources and was obsolete almost from the day it was first produced. Designed and put into production in 1938, just as tank armor was undergoing a quantum leap upwards in its ability to resist penetration, the big Swiss gun had several major things going against it. For one, 20mm was the upper limit for a cartridge weapon which could still be carried by 2 or 3 men and operated by one alone. Yet a conventional cartridge of 20mm was limited to a projectile of several ounces, and therefore had to rely on velocity and not explosive content to achieve its designed goals. The high muzzle velocity and the inherent accuracy of a close-tolerance weapon with a rifled bore meant that the Solothern could hit a tank at virtually any range where the shooter could still see the target. When the bullet struck a tank, however, virtually nothing happened. The 5-ounce projectile could penetrate no more than an inch of armor plate at 500 yards, and no tank made after 1940 was so lightly protected. In addition to being heavy, unwieldy, and ineffective on modern tank armor, the Solothern S18-1000 had a final flaw. It was made like a 100-pound Swiss chronometer. The precise fit and finish of its tool steel parts made it susceptible to jamming under conditions of neglect, and the man-hours and machining required to build a single example of the gun were sufficient to produce literally hundreds of cheap, lightweight, hand-carried rocket launchers capable of hitting a tank-sized object at a distance of 100 yards. The 4-pound rocket-propelled projectiles produced little recoil and carried shaped-charge warheads capable of blasting a hole through armor that was over 1 foot thick. In a modern war against World War II-era or later tanks, the Solothern S18-1000 was an utterly useless boat anchor. For Henry Bowman, however, it was a dream come true. "I hope this thing doesn't blow up," Henry said to himself as he prepared to fire the massive rifle. Ever since the first documented firearm had been fired in 1326, Henry's unbidden thought had been the instinctive wish of every gunner firing a large, unfamiliar weapon for the first time. When the pressure of Henry's fingers reached approximately 30 pounds, the Solothern's sear disengaged and the firing pin slammed into the primer. Henry Bowman had never fired a weapon that behaved anything like the way this one did. The 710-grain powder charge and the 2,160-grain bullet were both about 10 times as heavy as those in Henry's .357 Magnum Winchester Model 70 Max Collins had given him. As both bullet and burning powder blasted out the 52-inch barrel, a perforated muzzle brake which was threaded onto the end of the barrel redirected the high-velocity gases to the sides and back, reducing the 100-pound gun's recoil. The trade-off to this recoil reduction was increased concussion felt by the person firing the weapon. The sensation felt by the shooter, Henry would discover a few years later, could be closely duplicated by hanging a 2-inch diameter stick of 80% strength ditching dynamite by a thread from a tree limb and detonating it while standing 10 feet away. Henry's first thought as the gun lifted in recoil was, how on earth could they have expected a soldier to fire this thing without any ear protection? His second thought was to wonder how close the bullet had come to his aiming point. As the 7.5-foot-long gun moved Henry a few inches back under recoil, a white streak lanced out of the muzzle and disappeared into the side of an empty 55-gallon oil drum 140 yards distant. There was a barely visible flash, a puff of smoke, and a lot of dirt thrown into the air as the 1/3 pound bullet detonated on contact with the drum and the slug's hardened ally core slammed into the hillside a few feet beyond. The Solothern's recoil prevented Henry from seeing these things as they happened, but Walter was standing directly behind his son and saw the bullet's impact. A second later, Henry's eyes focused on the target site, and he could see that he had made a center hit. The oil drum was misshapen slightly, and Henry could see that a large part of the back of it had been blasted away. Sights seemed to be about on, Walter commented in a voice that was utterly devoid of emotion. "This thing is great!" Henry exclaimed. "Dad, you've got to try it! Wait, let me finish off this magazine first." Henry settled back down behind the optical sight, and in half a minute the 10-round magazine was empty. On the 10th shot, the magazine itself was ejected automatically from the gun. The Swiss designers had thoughtfully included this feature for rapid reloading in the heat of battle. Walter and Henry Bowman both looked at the distant target. It no longer resembled an oil drum. The metal was twisted and torn apart, and the hillside behind it showed the effects of the 10 high-velocity explosive projectiles. Henry was so excited he could hardly stand it. "We need some targets that are farther away," he said quickly. He scanned the area, trying to select a safe place to shoot the gun at a much longer distance. Then remembered that his father hadn't yet had a chance to shoot. "Here, let me get another magazine. You're gonna love this one, Dad," Henry assured his father. Walter obligingly stretched out behind the bipod-mounted weapon, gave a final check to make sure his earplugs were seated properly, and prepared to try Henry's new gun. When the magazine was empty, Walter also had a big smile on his face. "What do you think, Dad?" his son asked. "I think I'll tell your buddy we're gonna need more ammo," was all he said. New chapter here. Chapter 64. Final Flight. June 13th, 1967. Henry Bowman did not notice the strange look in his father's eyes as they slid the hangar door open. He also did not notice that it required just a little more effort than usual to pull the big Stearman out from the T hangar onto the taxiway. He was too focused on going flying with his father to pay attention to such little details. Henry buckled himself in and turned around to face his father. "All set, kiddo?" Walter asked his son. "Let me keep the controls for a while. I've got something I want to do that's a little unusual. Don't get too worried when you see it coming. After that, you take over and I'll take some pictures, okay? When we get low on fuel, bring it on back and land. Oh, one more thing. I bolted the lead back in the tail in case you wanted to do a B² or two." The puzzled look on Henry's face that had appeared with Walter's first comment was replaced with a smile. He loved making the Stearman tumble. Walter Bowman fired up the big radial engine and prepared to taxi. The recently finished Gateway Arch loomed ahead as the Bowmans flew over St. Louis at 3,000 feet. Walter had his 35mm Contarex camera strapped around his neck and chest with just enough slack so that he could lift the camera's viewfinder to his eye. The big Pratt & Whitney engine was howling along at full throttle as Walter raised the camera with his right hand and rolled the Stearman inverted with his left. He pulled back on the stick and put the biplane into a screaming inverted dive. When the nose of the plane was aimed at the spot on the ground exactly between the legs of the stainless steel monument and the altimeter read 1,200 feet, Walter aimed the camera and snapped the shutter. The plane was about 700 feet from the ground. The Gateway Arch was 630 feet tall. Walter was using his widest angle lens, fastest film, and smallest lens aperture setting so as to get the greatest depth of field for the shot. The image centered in the Contarex's viewfinder was of the top of his instrument panel, the back of Henry's head in the front cockpit hole, and the upside-down legs of the stainless steel structure. As soon as he felt the shutter release, Walter tensed his abdominal muscles and pulled forward on the stick with all the strength in his left arm. The Stearman flew dead center through the Gateway Arch and leveled at 200 feet above the ground, still inverted as it passed over the bank of the Mississippi River heading towards Illinois. Halfway across the river, Walter pushed harder on the stick and raised the nose. He let go of the camera, letting it dangle on its short leash. He took the stick in his right hand and eased back on the throttle with his left. At 2,000 feet, passing over the far bank and now flying above Illinois, Walter rolled the steerman upright and level. Only then did he feel the pain. It was like a hot poker in his right side. He closed his eyes and tried to will the agony to go away. When he opened them again, his son had turned around in the front cockpit and was staring at him with a huge grin on his face. Walter lifted both his hands in the air and nodded to Henry to show that he was turning over control of the plane. For the next half hour, Walter took pictures as Henry went through a number of aerobatic maneuvers. The pain in his side worsened, but Walter was too pleased with Henry's proficiency to let his discomfort spoil the pleasure he was getting. When Henry executed a perfect B-squared, Walter managed to snap 2 frames in the middle of the tumbling maneuver before the steerman fell into an inverted spin. Walter got off another shot before Henry reversed the controls and put the plane in a stable inverted dive before rolling it upright. As the airport came into view in the distance and Henry cut the throttle to begin his descent into the traffic pattern, Walter Bowman did something he had not done for many years. He unbuckled his harness and levered himself out onto the lower wing. Henry was startled to see Walter appear at the right side of the front cockpit hole. But he leaned over to the right and angled his head, knowing his father would want to yell something in his ear. "That was something I've always wanted to do. I think we did it fast enough that no one could have gotten any proof." Henry nodded in reply. What Walter had done a half hour before had been highly illegal. "Think you can land it with me standing here on the wing?" Henry snapped his head to the right and stared in disbelief at his father. He knew he had heard him correctly. Walter was laughing into the windblast, and motioned his son to turn his ear towards him again. "Go ahead," Walter yelled, "just like all the times before. You got a perfect headwind and I'm clipped to one of the flying wires. If it doesn't feel right, goose the throttle and make a go-around, and I'll get back in. Just remember that with the lead bolted in the tail, your CG is aft of the limit, even with me up here by you. So watch your aft stick, and don't do any inverted maneuvers on final approach," he joked. All of a sudden, Henry smiled and nodded. "Mom would have a heart attack if she saw this," he thought with an inward chuckle. "Assuming I don't crash, Dad'll be fine." He watched his airspeed and entered the downwind leg of the traffic pattern on a 45-degree angle, at an altimeter reading of 1,400 feet. The airport was 405 feet above sea level. Henry scanned the pattern for other aircraft. There were none. He maintained his descent as he turned onto the downwind leg. With his father standing on the right wing, he found that he had to put in a little more left rudder to hold the steerman in the proper altitude. Henry turned onto final approach 300 feet above the ground at an airspeed of 60 knots. He cut the throttle back to idle when he saw he could make the runway with no power. He was intent on the landing and did not see his father snapping pictures of him one-handed while holding onto the wing strut with the other. He also did not notice that there was no clip holding his father to any of the flying wires. At what he judged to be about 3 feet over the runway, Henry increased back pressure on the stick to halt his descent. He was jockeying with the rudder pedals to keep the nose aimed straight down the center line of the asphalt. The big biplane held its 3-foot altitude as Henry increased back pressure on the stick. The boy was glancing every couple of seconds at the airspeed indicator, watching it wind down. As the needle swung through and indicated 48 knots, the stick was all the way back in Henry's lap and the steerman settled gently onto the runway, no longer having sufficient speed to keep flying. The main gear and the tail wheel touched the asphalt at almost the same instant. With the 10-knot headwind, the steerman was only traveling about 40 miles per hour on the ground, but Henry knew that he was now at the most critical point of the landing. With the tricycle gear airplane, which had become the most common type starting in the 1950s, the steerable third wheel was in the nose, ahead of the airplane's center of gravity. In this inherently stable system, the plane would attempt to return to a straight path if the nose gear were turned to one side and then released. A conventional gear plane like the steerman had its third wheel in the rear, behind the center of gravity. This was better for landing on poor terrain, where 2 large main gear in the front could endure forces that would snap off a single, more fragile nose gear. The drawback was that having the third, steerable wheel in the rear created an inherently unstable system. If a tailwheel airplane got angled more than a small amount to one side, the plane would continue swinging around so that its center of gravity ended up in front of the main landing gear. This was called a ground loop. If it happened at any speed greater than a slow walk, the airplane would tip over and put a wingtip into the ground, causing substantial damage. Tail-dragger pilots had to quickly, judiciously, and continually use the rudder and brake pedal to keep the plane aimed straight until its ground speed was down to a crawl. Henry knew if he allowed the nose to swing more than slightly out of line, he could not prevent a ground swoop, for even the finest pilot in the world could not repeal the laws of physics. The problem was magnified by the tall landing gear that was installed on the custom Stearman, necessary to provide ground clearance for the oversized prop. Walter, however, had taught his son well, and as the biplane settled onto the runway, Henry held the stick all the way back to plant the tail wheel firmly on the asphalt, and he kept the nose pointed straight with quick, precise jabs of the rudder pedals. The Stearman coasted down to walking speed, and Henry pushed gently on the right brake and turned off the runway at midfield. Only then did he glance over at his father, who was smiling broadly. Henry tapped the left brake and blipped the throttle, and the Stearman turned onto the taxiway and headed for the hangar at the rate of a man's brisk trot. "Let's put her to bed and go get something to eat, eh? You hungry?" Walter asked after Henry had pulled the mixture control to full lean and the engine had quit. "Real hungry, Dad. Steak and Shake suit ya?" he asked, naming their favorite drive-in. "Sounds perfect." His father jumped off the wing and walked back to the Stearman's tail to swing it around before pushing the plane back into the hangar. The pain in Walter's side had eased to a dull ache. "Your maneuvers were better than ever today, son. You really greased in that landing, too." Walter took another bite of his steak burger. His appetite wasn't what it normally was. Henry smiled at the compliment, then asked his father something that had puzzled him all morning. "Dad, when you flew through the arch, weren't you afraid of losing your license? No one else has a plane that looks like this one. What if someone reports us?" Walter smiled, but his face was filled with sadness. "It doesn't matter, Henry. My medical is up this month, and I wouldn't pass if I tried to renew it. That was my last flight in a Stearman, son. It's one of the reasons I wanted to go flying with you today. I needed to talk to you about it." Henry put down the french fries he had been about to put in his mouth and stared at his father. "What do you mean you can't pass the physical? What's wrong, Dad?" Walter took a very deep breath before answering. "I've got cancer, son. Renal cancer. That's when it's in your kidneys, and it's one of the really bad ones." Henry was horrified. His father was in better shape than the parents of most all of his classmates at school. He could not believe what he was hearing. Cancer? But they can't do anything about it? The boy tried frantically to persuade himself that his father was going to be all right, but he knew he would not. Henry had watched his grandfather, Charles Collins, wasting away to nothing from throat cancer 5 years before. They're doing it right now. That's why I'm out flying today. But I've been losing some weight, as I'm sure you can see, and the pain in my sides comes more often. It's one of those things, Henry, just like Grandpa. He smiled with genuine warmth. "Oh, I'll be around for a while. You haven't seen the last of your dear old dad just yet." "I may be through with flying, but no aviator ever had a better send-off than the one I just had with you today." Henry stared at his lap. He had entirely lost his appetite. Walter Bowman continued matter-of-factly. "I thought for a long time about what to do with the Stearman. I always wanted it to be yours one day. But you're only 15, and wouldn't be able to fly it on your own for another 1.5 years. Also, it's got some serious expenses coming up. An air show pilot has made me a very good offer on it. He's got a clip-wing Cub with 140 Lycoming in it, an inverted system, aileron spades, and a big tires for landing almost anywhere. It's registered experimental. He's going to trade it to me, along with quite a bit of cash. You'll have your own aeroship you can solo on your 16th birthday, and the gas costs won't break you. I'm going to put the money in an account that will be yours when you turn 21. Should be worth quite a bit by then." Walter didn't mention the life insurance policy, or that Henry would also start getting his Social Security. "I think that's a better plan for the long run." Henry nodded without looking up. He wasn't thinking about flying. He was imagining what his life would be like without his father. "When did you find out, Dad?" he asked finally. "Last week they finished up the last of their tests at Barnes. There's no doubt now. Your mother suspected ever since I first started feeling really ill. She's the reason they caught it this early, and were able to give me some medicine that helps with the pain." Henry turned to look out the window so his father wouldn't see him crying. Henry Bowman was absolutely miserable as he got out of the car and went to open the garage door for his father. He watched as Walter Bowman put the car into its space and opened the door to get out. Henry stared at his father as he climbed out of the car. He was searching for a visible sign of Walter's affliction. His father, however, looked the same as he always had. It was hard to believe that this strong, vital man harbored a fatal disease that was relentlessly killing him. Walter stepped over to the side of the garage where a tarpaulin hung down, covering something. "If we can't fly together, then you and I are going to have to do more shooting instead." Henry could not believe his eyes as his father pulled away the tarpaulin. There were 20 wooden crates stacked against the wall, all with German lettering stenciled on their sides. He'd have to get out his manual to decipher the words exactly, but Henry needed no dictionary to translate 20mm, and the crates themselves were familiar in design. 2 empty ones had been sitting in a corner of the basement for more than a month. Walter's smile broadened as he watched Henry's reaction. "There's some more other calibers coming," he explained, "but I thought I'd better jump on the ammo for your Solothern first. Your buddy made me a deal I just couldn't pass up." Henry Bowman started crying again, but this time he did not turn away. New chapter here. Chapter 65. The Death of Dr. King. April 5th, 1968. My dad says he's surprised it didn't happen sooner. Some of the students gathered outside the lunchroom nodded gravely at this assessment. The Strooks boy did not add that his father had also said, "And I hope they give the guy who did it a medal." John Burroughs' school believed in promoting academic excellence and opening pupils' minds, but some parents differed with the institution's philosophy of racial harmony. Mr. Sturks wasn't the only father who, in the security of his own living room, was not afraid to assert that the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was no great loss to the civilized world. "I still can't believe somebody shot him." This was another student who, like the vast majority of his classmates at John Burroughs High School, came from a white, upper-class St. Louis family. Like a somewhat smaller, but nonetheless large, number of Burroughs students, if the 10th grader had been asked 24 hours earlier who Dr. King was, he would have been unable to answer. "I'd like to kill the guy who did it," the sophomore added with great conviction. "To spare Mrs. King from having to return to Memphis?" Henry Bowman asked, deadpan. The others looked at him oddly, but no one said anything in reply. "Everybody at the paper is expecting real trouble," a short brown-haired girl broke in. Her father worked on the editorial page of the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, one of the 2 dailies that serve the metropolitan area. "Dad's afraid we'll have race riots." The girl's father was not the only person in St. Louis to hold that opinion. Elsewhere, "Jesus fucking Christ, do you think you've got enough ammo?" The mayor of Wellston asked his chief of police as he watched the man bring 2 more cans and put them in the pile. There were now over 40 of the metal boxes stacked up against the air vent. It was the first time the mayor had been on the roof of City Hall, and he marveled at the number of cigarette butts he saw on the dyed tar paper. He turned his attention back to the current project. "And do you really think this is a good idea?" The mayor was not at all sure that placing a live tripod-mounted heavy-barreled Browning 50 caliber belt-fed machine gun with an effective range of 7,300 yards on the edge of the roof of Wellston City Hall was the most appropriate response to local concerns about possible rioting. "We likely won't see any trouble in this area at all, sir," he added. His tone showed more hope than conviction. Wellston was one of the poorer areas of St. Louis, and in poor neighborhoods, crime is often a major issue. Both the mayor and the police chief knew that any breakdown in security would be recognized as a perfect opportunity for potential looters. "You're damn right we won't see any trouble," the chief said with mild indignation. His face glistened with sweat from the effort of lugging an 80-pound machine gun, 40-pound tripod, and several thousand rounds of linked ammunition up from the storeroom. His smile was bright. "Put old Ma Deuce up here, where every damn one with a mind to bust windows and loot can get a good long look, with me or Jack sitting behind her. Won't be any riots up here, sir. Old Uncle drilled it into my head real well back in Korea. You take care of Ma Deuce and she'll take care of you." He looked intently at the mayor. "You recall any riots in Wellston when they had that mess in Watts back in 1965? The mayor shook his head. They had erected the big Browning on the roof 3 years earlier, during the riots in California. They had also called a meeting with local ministers and other community leaders so that the members of their congregations could be encouraged to take similar measures to protect their homes and businesses. Delinquents in Wellston got the clear message that looting would not be tolerated, and that "you loot, we shoot" was official city policy. The M2 heavy barrel 50 BMG on the roof of City Hall had been a constant reminder that during the Watts riots, Wellston had avoided the violence and theft that plagued other areas. As it turned out, the strategy was once again exactly right. Would-be rioters in Wellston rapidly concluded that other neighborhoods offered more opportunity, and Wellston remained peaceful. New chapter here. Chapter 66. The American Afrikaner of Angola. April 6, 1968. Got a safari planned any time soon, Mr. Baxter? Al Goodman asked in his nasal monotone. Most gun shop conversations across the country that day centered around the King assassination, but at Goodman's the talk, as always, revolved around fine guns and big game hunting. Not right now, no. I've got another baby on the way. Maybe in a couple of years. And when I do go again, it won't be to Portuguese Angola. Those ballhunks are the worst excuse for professional hunters I've ever seen in my life. The man shook his head in disgust at the memory. They can't imagine doing any stalking on foot. They want you to do all your shooting on the Jeep. And they don't have a clue where to look for the game. I ended up being the guide most of the time while they sat back. Max Collins, who was several yards away looking at a Perazzi trap gun, listened in. He had been considering a safari himself, and the booking agent had been pushing him to sign up for 3 weeks in Angola. The man who was speaking was about 30. Max had seen him in Goodman's before and knew him vaguely. He listened as the younger man continued. I think Rhodesia next time. Baxter went on. That or back to Kenya. But I'd like to go someplace new, you know? The booking agent I've been talking to has been pushing for Angola, Max said, joining the conversation. They always recommend whatever they've sent people on before. That's fine if they've got some basis for comparison, but a lot of these guys have never even been to Africa themselves and push whoever'll give them the fattest percentage. I'm in insurance, so believe me, I know how that works. It sounds like you've got some experience there. You'd advise against Angola? Oh, don't get me wrong, there's all kinds of game in Angola right now. It's just that the Portuguese guides are atrocious, if mine was typical, and I think he was. To give you an example, the pro I had, the trigger on his rifle was screwed up and he never had it fixed. Stryker wouldn't stay cocked unless he put the safety on while he was closing the bolt. Then the gun would fire when he took the safety off. So he didn't back you up? That was the problem. No backup would have been fine with me. This idiot used his gun the way it was. What do you mean? He'd close the bolt while engaging the safety, then fire it by flicking the safety off instead of pulling the trigger? Yeah, exactly. Baxter paused for effect and then added, and he said his gun had been that way for over a year. Max shook his head in amazement. Then Baxter remembered something. Now, I did meet a white hunter while I was over there who was born here in the States. Don't know much else about him, only talked to him at the airport. Seemed to know his stuff, though. If you're serious about going to Angola, I think you should try to find out more about him. Who is he? Guy from, where was it? Colorado, I think, he said. Bit young for a pro. About my age, but competent. His name is Raymond Johnson. New chapter here. Chapter 67. Hospice. April 27th, 1968. Walter Bowman was down to 105 pounds. He had survived 10 months longer than the 12 weeks that the cancer specialist had privately given him to live, but it was evident that now all of his reserves had been exhausted. He had been unable to speak for several days. Henry waved the private nurse out of the way, sat down next to the bed, and took his father's hand. He stared down at the husk of what had so recently been a very strong man. Henry looked at his father for a long time. Walter's eyes were still clear. After a time, though, the stricken man shook his head almost imperceptibly. Henry saw the gesture immediately. He swallowed. It's time, isn't it? Walter Bowman's head moved a fraction of an inch in a nod. Henry nodded in reply. Keep the front cockpit open for me, Dad. We'll go flying the next time I see you. I promise. Henry felt his hand clasped in a powerful grip that shocked him with its intensity, and he instinctively returned it. As quickly as he had become taught, his father's muscles went slack. Walter Bowman was dead. Christ, I'm tearing up a little here. Anyway, that ends that chapter. Heavy moment. Press F to pay respects. No less heavy for it, really. Anyway, new chapter here. Chapter 68. Bobby Kennedy Assassination. June 5th, 1968. Actually, let's finish this one off here. A bit of a heavy way to leave things off, but seems as good a place as any. It is now Friday, July 3rd, 2020 at 8:03 p.m. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Auf Wiedersehen.